Well, I hope you took the time to study Exodus chapter 1 this week. If not, why not take, even now, just 30 minutes to look for the flow of the scenes in chapter 1. Look at it like it's a movie, because that's how we look at story, just how it moves from one scene to the next. And then you look for repeated thoughts or themes in that story. Welcome to Bible Study for Life Transformation with Dr. George Budd. Okay, let's get right into the passage and begin with outlining. Let me show you the breakdown of the passage as I saw it. This is the outline of scene-by-scene changes in the story. These can be a location change or a people change. You kind of treat it like scenes in a movie. So if you take a look at the pics that are here, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. There's Reuben and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a king over Egypt. You can see how there's like in a movie there would be a change of scene. It's like it was a narration of the setup at the first part and then a change of scene. So now we've got another section that's here. There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, so now he's talking, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. You can see how there's a bit of a transition. If you were doing this for a movie, a scene, or a play, there would be something that a narrator would transition. You'd see a picture or something about the taskmasters. So a bit of a change. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithon and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. Again, that could go with the one before, or you could separate it out here because of how you might have pictures of how they were afraid of them with their numbers. Verse 13. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, made their lives bitter and hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And then the king of Egypt, and that one, by the way, would be all of the pictures of slavery and the things that were happening. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, again, you can see the change of scenes. Now you've got the king talking to the midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. And when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. And again, you see the shift in the story. It's like a picture in my mind. You can see it shift to another scene. And now back to another one. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." So that's how I saw the passage flowing from scene to scene as you go through it. Now the next step is to make some observations about it. And for that, I jot down my thoughts as they come to me, even during the outlining. But I don't try to answer any of the questions I have or fill in the details until I have the outlining completed. And you can see I use different colors to help me identify the linked ideas. And the first thing I saw was a key transition verse. Something had changed. And you see it with the blue highlight that is there. It's kind of a question of timing. And this became a fun rabbit trail that I'm going to get into in a moment. But this book this event happens between eras, between books, really. You've got Genesis, which ends with Joseph and taking care of his family and the plenty that's there. And then Exodus begins with oppression and the coming of Moses. And chapter 1 kind of explains the change. It sets the stage for all of that. And connected to this timing question is an obvious theme of fear. The Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites. And so you can see that all the way through. They were afraid. They were in dread of them. And so I kind of highlighted that. And then I noticed a repeated theme of Israel's growing numbers. And you see that with kind of the tan information all the way down there. This happened because of God's blessing in them. And so I marked all of that everywhere I saw it in the passage. And the reason is that just helps it pop off the page for me. And as I'm studying it, there was one other thing that hit me, and I thought it was an odd word. You can see the word escape that's over there in verse 8. If they were afraid of them, why would they not just want them to go? What's this about escape? And with that, I saw a couple of other interesting words. A little further down, you've got spread abroad, and they must have been spreading literally throughout all of Egypt, becoming indispensable, and then slaves. I wondered as that word hit me, I thought, well, how did they go from being the workers who benefit the nation to becoming slaves under taskmasters? Now let me take you down that fun rabbit trail for a little bit. The timing for this event is a very interesting study. It helps to understand how Israel went from being helpful workers benefiting Egypt to becoming feared people who were enslaved. And really, this is kind of a context part of the study. Where does this fit in the flow of history itself? Because it is an historical event. So what was going on when it took place? I hated history. When I was growing up, I hated it. Until I saw how it was connected to actually understanding the Bible and its message for us today, and then I was absolutely hooked on what was going on in history. And Egypt in history was a key player in the events of the region of Palestine. So they would rise to power in the region, and they would be pushing back Assyrians and the Babylonians or whoever it was that was rising to power on the other side of Palestine. And they'd go through Palestine, and then others would come down to Egypt. They would weaken, be plundered by the nations from the north. But Egypt had pharaohs, and they ruled in a period known as dynasties. And during their history, there are an interesting group of rulers known as the Hyksos rulers, who became the 15th dynasty. Now, there were dynasties, and the interesting thing about their dynasties in Egypt is in a big enough area, there were dynasties in the north on the delta of the Nile, and then down in the south near Thebes area, there were dynasties that were down there, and these rulers could rule at the same time and overlap from the north and the south. And but when the 15th dynasty ruled, they literally took over the whole of Egypt for a while. But it's the timing that's interesting. The Hyksos rulers in the 15th dynasty ruled from 1620 to 1520 BC. And interestingly, they were Semitic in ethnicity, which means they were from Palestine. They had Canaanite or Hittite backgrounds. And the Semitic nations moved into that eastern delta area about 1800 BC. And that movement is usually, when nations are moving and going from one location to another, it's usually a sign of famine somewhere or war. And here's the tidbit of info for us. Is it possible that Joseph and Jacob moved Israel down to Egypt around that very time? The Bible talks about a fair amount of migration going on due to the famine. In Genesis chapter 42, verse 5, it says, "Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan." So you have all of these Semitic people moving down into Egypt. The Hyksos rulers lived in that region, that eastern delta, from 1800 on. And if Israel moved down there at the same time and were welcomed by the Pharaoh, they would not have been accepted by the other Semitic tribes because they had different gods than them, or the bottom line is they refused to worship the gods of the Canaanites. So by 1620, this Hyksos group had grown strong enough to actually take over all of Egypt. And here's why these people are important. There are two dates proposed for the Exodus by scholars: 1440 BC and 1280 BC under Ramesses. If it is 1280, then Pharaoh, the Pharaoh that had welcomed Jacob under Joseph, would have been the last of the pre-Hyksos pharaohs, meaning there are two possibilities for the forgetting pharaohs. Either the very first Hyksos ruler in 1620, he would not have trusted Israel. They had different gods, and Israel had, what we know, spent 400 years in Egypt, which would mean that from the 1280 date, you go backwards, they had 340 years of slavery under the Hyksos rulers and beyond. More likely is that the first true Egyptian ruler, 1520, would not trust Israel as a Semitic people. That would mean that they had about 240 years of slavery from 1520 to 1280. Because those Semitic people that they didn't drive out, they then enslaved. But if the date was 1440 for the Exodus, meaning that they came with the early Semitic tribes in the 1800 BC, then either they were persecuted and enslaved after the Hyksos were defeated in 1520, which would mean there were only 80 years of slavery, or if the Hyksos rulers didn't trust them, which is, by the way, a likely scenario given their comments about joining the enemies in verse 8, it would have meant 180 years of slavery. Personally, I like the 1440 date. Most conservative scholars pick that date, by the way, and that's because it fits better into the timing of the judges and the start of the kings and 400 years in Egypt prior to all of that. But you can do your own study on that if it interests you. It can be your rabbit trail. Anyhow, that was my rabbit trail this week. Let's move on to the author's point. Why did the author write this story at this point and in this way? What was his point? What was his purpose? Well, now that we've got the context for these events, that gives some perspective for the themes we see in the passage. So, what I did here was to note the themes and then to tie them all together. Being fruitful was God's blessing, and it led to problems for them. Fear is obviously a dominant theme, and I wrote it in there. And by the way, I kind of assumed it's kind of fear from forgetting the benefits of the relationship they had with God's blessed people. And fear escalated. And then there's the escalation of oppression. It's another theme that's there. The greater the fear, the worse that things got for them. And the author's point, I kind of just scribbled it down. God's blessing led to fear-filled oppression by those who forgot the reciprocal benefits of God's blessing that it brought for them. But that led me to this for kind of a formal outline of it all. God's blessing led to fear-filled oppression by those who forgot the reciprocal benefits that God's blessing brought them. As God blessed Israel, fear dominated the thinking of the Egyptians. They were too many, they were too mighty, from verse 8. And then as God blessed more, the fear secured their safety. They made sure that they would serve them. And as God blessed more, the fear escalated to actual hatred. They wanted to kill them. So you've got they're afraid of them because there's too many. They forced them into slavery to try to secure their safety. And then they actually turned to outright hatred against them. Now, if I was to preach this, I'd tweak it a bit more. I'd want to bring the so what into that statement, the main statement in some way, because you want to move towards what difference does it make. And I'd probably say something about this needing to avoid the fear-filled actions by looking at these things or being aware of these things or so forth. But this brings us to the so what. What does this passage teach us or show us about life with God? What would God want us to do or avoid in this case? Now, I think this story is a perfect example of what happens when a culture lets fear take over. They forgot how they had benefited from the blessings God was pouring out on Israel. And just like our culture, by the way, forgets how they have benefited from the Judeo-Christian roots that are the foundation for all we enjoy in Canada. And that fear that took over, it led to mistrust, bigotry, hatred, and persecution for Israel. Just like our culture is in danger of experiencing if we are not careful with how fear takes over. So let's talk about that fear for a minute or two, as that is the dominant theme of this week's study. And it is one of the so what points we can apply from this story. We ought to be concerned about the culture of fear that has developed in the last few months. Just the word pandemic by itself, it instills fear in people. Fear of dying, of being exposed to it, of being out of control. We can't control or do anything about this thing. This is especially concerning in a humanistic worldview. If you only have this life to live, then that pandemic is going to create in you a huge amount of fear. Media, politicians, health services, they have used fear to make people get serious about their guidelines for how to live during this time. And it has caused more fear. The outbreaks in nursing homes, they have added to the fears. You see it in yourself. You can't walk down the pathways of town without avoiding people. You look askew at anyone who coughs in a store. Outbreaks in factories and groups with low-paying jobs among immigrant population in particular cause fear about just being around them. You don't know what their cultural practices are. They are different than us. You don't know their living conditions. You're concerned. There is fear. That culture of fear was demonstrated in our passage as well. Now, in that day, it was tribe against tribe, nation against nation. That was a common thing. So when the Israelites became numerous, the Egyptians became nervous. All the past goodwill, it was tossed in the trash. The greater the fear, the greater the mistrust. You think about the implications of that for our culture. Fear will lead to conspiracy theories, the blame game, mistrust, and even hatred and bigotry. You think about it, when people of Chinese descent wish they didn't look Chinese. And it is happening. What does that say about what they have felt and heard? When the Filipinos feel more isolated in our culture than ever before, what do you think caused that? And what gets forgotten? The reciprocal nature of the blessings we bring to one another's lives. We need one another. We benefit one another. The very thing the Egyptians forgot in our passage in Exodus chapter 1. So how do we deal with the fear? How do we not get caught up in it? Well, a few verses came to mind as I thought about how to deal with that fear. The first was kind of a natural. 1 John 4:18, there is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. And the rest of the verse is, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. And we know that that verse is obviously talking about God's love for us and how we need to understand that. But what can we learn about being that love in a world where fear dominates people's lives? After all, aren't we to be a people who love as God loved us? I mean, we're going to study this verse actually next week, just to make sure we have it right. The other verse that came to mind was 1 Peter 2 and verses 11 and 12. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, meaning we aren't part of this world, we're not living for here, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. To abstain from the passions of the flesh. Don't do what comes naturally, he's saying. Don't let the hatred and the fear take over, so that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. Find things to do that will demonstrate God's love. Do you know what I think? I think that you, as a believer, will be needed in our society now more than ever before. No one can demonstrate God's perfect love to this world except you. His persevering, rescuing, redemptive love, you have experienced it, you live it, you embody it for others. We are the ones who can best derail the fear train. And we can keep it from destroying the foundations of our society. Do not get caught up in the conspiracy train. You know exactly where it's headed. You know what it creates. Instead, find ways to express and live out love for your neighbors. Those who are overcome with fear. Those who have been marginalized by the fear. Beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. That's 1 John 4:7. May our God, who is love, fill you with the power of his Spirit to be a walking, talking demonstration of his love for a lost and needy world this week. So next week, let's take a closer look at 1 John 4:13-21. I mean, we might as well check out this verse in its context. Perfect love casts out fear. I encourage you to take an hour or so next week before Friday and outline the passage. I mean, it's a letter in this case, so you're going to look for verbs and see how all of these verbs, how the writer hangs the thoughts off of those verbs. Write down your observation questions, your thoughts. Take a look at words that pop off the page for you. You can look them up later, but write them all down as you're going through the passage. Check the context of the passage. How does the paragraph or the section relate to the ones right before it or just after it? Write down the author's point. What was he trying to get across? Because you understand, God inspired him to write. That means that is God's message for us. What he was seeking to get across, the author. Finally, the so what. What do you do with what you have learned? That's the application side. And by the way, there's still time to sign up for my class on how to study the Bible. It's scheduled for Monday, June 1st, then the Thursday, the 4th, and Monday, June the 8th. 3 evenings. And you can go to my website to register, bistflt.com, and I shortened it from Bible Study for Life Transformation. Or if you're on Facebook, you can go to Bible Study for Life Transformation. Anyhow, until next week, God bless.